The senator from South Dakota is recognized.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to enter in a colloquy with my Republican colleagues for up to 20 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, as we all know, the most important issues that are facing our country today are the economy, job creation, the national debt, and excessive government spending. One of the things that is having a huge effect on job creation and the economy right now is regulation. The administration continues to overreach and overstep in the implementation of dozens of new regulations, be it the EPA's regulating greenhouse gases or the DOT's recent proposal that would require commercial driver's licenses for farmers who drive tractors. And these oversteps have real consequences in the form of jobs. Take, for instance, Mr. Thomas Clements from Youngsville, Louisiana, who is testifying today in front of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Mr. Clements is a small business owner since 2008. He owns oilfield CNC machining with his wife, and they produce metal parts and systems for offshore oil rigs. His run-in with our overreaching administration started after the tragic 2010 BP oil spill with the President's decision in May of 2010 to enact a 6-month moratorium on new oil drilling in the Gulf. His business continues to struggle today because of the Department of Interior's decision to slow-walk new drilling permits. Before these actions, he had a thriving small business that not only provided for his family, but also for his employees. Today, they're barely staying afloat and will likely close unless the administration changes course and actually begins taking steps toward recovery instead of just continued rhetoric. Another big drag on the economy is the amount of spending and debt. Just yesterday, the Congressional Budget Office released their long-term budget outlook. This was certainly sobering reading. They pointed out that under the alternative fiscal scenario in 2024, interest costs, Social Security, and major health spending would exceed all of the revenue coming in to the government. The need for action is clear. The Congressional Budget Office states that these levels of debt will cause incomes to be between 7% and 18% lower in 2035 than they would be otherwise. Another study by economists Reinhardt and Rogoff found that countries with a debt-to-GDP level that is greater than 90%, and I would emphasize, Mr. President, that we are currently at 95%, but that countries with a debt-to-GDP level greater than 90% grow at 1 percentage point less than they would otherwise. In other words, when you're carrying this kind of a debt load, 90% debt to GDP for a sustained period of time, you're bleeding about 1% of economic growth every single year. And as we know from the President's own economic advisors, a 1% reduction, 1% drop in growth translates into about 1 million lost jobs. Now, one of the places that we see that have been really hard hit in our country by the downturn is the state of Ohio. My colleague from Ohio, Senator Portman, is here, and I would be interested perhaps in hearing from him on whether he has seen the evidence of the recovery that's promised by the administration, or does his economy in Ohio still reflect an economy that's held back by excessive regulation, debt, and spending? I'd be interested in the senator from Ohio's perspective on that particular subject.
Well, first of all, I thank my colleague from South Dakota for – thank you, Mr. President. I thank my colleague from South Dakota for coming to the floor today to talk about the economy and jobs. It's clearly the top issue on the minds of folks in Ohio. And no, the Ohio economy is still hurting. We're not creating the jobs we hope to create. If you look at it nationally, there are now 14 million Americans who are out of work. And more than 1 million want to work but have given up looking for work. So, when you look at what's going on out there, you add the 8.5 million Americans who are getting by with part-time jobs, even though they'd like to work full-time. That's about 23 million Americans suffering from the lack of the full-time job that they want. So this unemployment issue continues to be the #1 issue in Ohio and nationally. We've got to address it. And you talked a little today about some of the ways that we need to approach it, including the regulatory overreach and its impact on jobs and small businesses. But let me talk about even a deeper concern in Ohio, and that's the length of time people have been out of work. The average unemployment now is 40 weeks. So that's about 9 months. 9 months. So it's 9 months of stress, 9 months of uncertainty, 9 months of wondering how to make ends meet. This is, I'm told, the worst statistic in terms of length of being unemployed that we've had since the records were kept. So it is not just about these terrible unemployment numbers. It's a fact that when you've been out that long, you lose some of your job skills, you have a gap in your resume, it's harder to get a job. And this is not what was promised, by the way. If you look at what the President and his economists promised when the stimulus was passed, they said that unemployment today would be about 6.7%. Instead, it's over 9%, 9.1%. So it hasn't worked. The President has called it a bump in the road. I unfortunately think it's a lot more than that. The Chairman of the Federal Reserve talked about this yesterday, that he's very concerned now about some of the economic projections. He thinks that we are not in as good a shape as even the projections, which weren't very optimistic, show. 1.8% was the growth in the first quarter. At this point, in the last deep recession we had, the growth was 7%. On the spending side, this chart's interesting because it shows federal spending as a percent of the economy, which, as we all know, has gone up significantly, and part of that is because of the stimulus package and then the unemployment rate. And unfortunately, when you look at this, there has not been an increase in spending and a decrease in unemployment. There's been an increase in spending and an increase in unemployment. So I think, you know, this simple notion that you can't spend your way to prosperity, which is a common sense notion that most Americans agree with, has been proven to be true. Unfortunately, the stimulus package did not lead to the kind of progress the President and his team predicted, and you know, we're all paying the price for it. So instead, we need to approach it in a different way. And again, as you mentioned earlier, Senator Thune, part of the answer to this is dealing with the regulations, dealing with our tax system, dealing with these high energy costs, dealing with the high health care costs, which do impact employment, getting the economy back on track through smart pro-growth policies. I know that you also have done a lot of thinking about how do we get out of this mess that we're in instead of the spending, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on what you think about what the debt and the spending is doing to our economy. You mentioned the Rogoff and Reinhardt study showing that our economy would be growing much faster than it is now, but for this big overhang of spending and deficit and debt. But I wonder, Senator Thune, if you had some additional thoughts on that.
Well, I wish I could say to my colleague from Ohio, and I appreciate his observations regarding his state, which is a pivotal state when it comes to whether or not we are going to see the economy recover. Obviously, a state that feels the impact right away when you have a down economy and job losses and all the negative things that go with that. And so I appreciate his perspective on it, and obviously I wish I could say that this administration and their policies had made the situation better. Unfortunately, the evidence overwhelmingly points to the President and his policies making this situation worse and much worse. For example, as you mentioned, non-defense discretionary spending, which is the part of the spending that the President has to sign into law every year, went up 24% since he took office, which is an astounding amount, particularly when you consider the fact that inflation at that time, over that time period, was about 2%. So government spending was growing at about 10 times the rate of inflation. And what's even more amazing is that this doesn't include the increases in discretionary spending attributable to the stimulus. The stimulus, as we all know, was about $1 trillion of spending that, as the Senator from Ohio pointed out, was supposed to have brought the unemployment rate down to 6.7%. Clearly, we're over 9% today. There is no correlation between additional spending and job creation. I think we've clearly demonstrated that. That spending level does not include the spending on the Cash for Clunkers program, which was supposed to have been something that was going to create jobs. It doesn't include unoffset increases in spending on mandatory programs that have been signed into law, like additional unemployment insurance, Medicaid, or trade adjustment assistance. And it doesn't include a variety of different spending increases that the President has fought for, but so far been unsuccessful in passing. So because of this exorbitant spending, we are now at a point where literally 40 cents out of every dollar that the federal government spends is borrowed. Now, while most people would look at this situation and say it's time to do something about it to improve the situation, the President clearly punted. Over the medium and the long term, his proposed budget makes the situation even worse. And in fact, the proposed fiscal year 2012 budget would spend, this was the President's proposal, would spend $46 trillion over the 10-year time period, add $9.47 trillion to the debt, and raise taxes by $1.6 trillion. So their prescription continues to be more spending, more borrowing, and higher taxes. So the question is, I think, is this helping or hurting our economy? And if you look at a recent Bloomberg poll, it found that 65% of Americans think that the debt is a major reason why our unemployment rate is so high. So the answer from the American people is clear. And I guess what I would ask of my colleague from Ohio, and he and I have worked together on some ideas on how we can get the economy going again and create an environment that's conducive to job growth. Clearly, getting spending under control here is a huge factor in that. And as he pointed out, you know, there's lots of research out there that demonstrates the connectivity between spending and debt and the economy. I would simply add, too, the rating agencies have all weighed in on this subject. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, they all have come in and said, given a negative assessment to our credit rating, if that led to a downgrade in our credit rating, it would reflect be reflected in much higher interest rates, would have another negative impact on our economy. So lots of things about spending and debt clearly have a profound and negative impact on our ability to grow the economy and create jobs. But I'm interested in the senator from Ohio has been a great leader on getting out there in front and talking about things, real solutions that would lead to job creation in this country. And I'd be interested in hearing his thoughts about some of the things that we might be able to do that clearly are not being done today, and frankly, things that I hope would be contrary to policies being put forward by this administration, which are costing us jobs.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are a number of things that can be done, and there's really no reason this can't be done on a bipartisan basis. I just left a hearing in the Governmental Affairs Committee where we talked about regulations, its impact on the economy. And today, the cost of regulations to the economy, hitting particularly small businesses, is about $1.75 trillion. That's more than the IRS collects in income taxes. And there were Democrats and Republicans alike talking about proposals concerned about the administration's continued regulations. The President said some of the right things, but if you look at the facts, there are more and more regulations, have a bigger and bigger impact. Here in Washington, it's tough to get this under control without changing the law, in my view. So we need to have better process in the agencies to force them to look at cost-benefit analysis, to force them to use the least costly, least burdensome alternative, and so on. So I talked about some legislation we introduced in that area today, as did other, again, Democrats and Republicans alike. So there's some things that we have to do. To your point about the impact of this debt and deficit on the job front, you're absolutely right. And this poll you talked about where 65% of Americans think that the debt and deficit is a major factor in the high unemployment, they're right. The study you talked about said that if the debt gets past 90% of our economy, it's estimated to cost about 1 million jobs. Here's where we are today. 2010, 93%. We're now at about 100%. We'll be at 105% in 2012 next year. So this is what's happening, is that we are going into exactly that period of where our debt is bigger than our whole economy. And this study, by the way, is based on looking at countries all around the world who have gone through this experience, including countries in Europe that are going through it now, and seeing what the impact is on jobs. And there are solutions. Talked about regulations a second ago. That's certainly one of them. And my hope is that this Senate can vote on sensible regulatory reform, and soon. The story you told earlier about the oil and gas industry, we see this played out all over. Recent proposed regulations from the EPA on emissions from power plants in terms of mercury. All of us want clean air. We know you have to have regulations. The question is, how do you regulate? These particular regulations, very onerous, not coming through Congress, are going to have a big impact on jobs in my state. There's a study out a couple weeks ago saying that it's going to result in thousands of jobs being lost and a few power plants being shut down and electricity costs increasing 10 to 15% in our state. We can't afford that. We want to keep our costs down. But there's more than that. There's the tax code. We should, again, as a body here and in the House and the administration, reform our tax code to make it simpler, to make it more pro-growth, and it can be done. Economists across the spectrum say, look, this current code is a mess. It doesn't work because you're encouraging businesses to make investments, to allocate their resources based on some tax-motivated reason rather than a business reason. And by lowering the rate, getting rid of a lot of these preferences in the code, sort of clearing out the code, you could, as happened in 1986, get more economic growth through the tax code simplification and reform. So this is something that I think the time is here. The President's Fiscal Commission recommended this. When they said, how do you look at the next 20 or 30 years and come up with a way to deal with this deficit and debt, they said you've got to have economic growth as part of it. They're absolutely right. And part of what they recommended specifically was tax reform. Making our workforce more competitive. Today, we do spend money at the federal level on workforce development, and yet it's not spent very efficiently. So there are some organizations that do it better than others. We should take those best practices and apply them generally. There are now 9 different agencies and departments that are engaged in looking at how to improve our workforce for the 21st century. It is a federal program that, when it connects directly with businesses, works. When it doesn't work well. There's all kinds of opportunities to reform that program. Again, this should be bipartisan. I hear about it all the time from community colleges, from businesses, what's working, what's not working. Flexibility is the key thing I hear. These federal programs have a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy attached to them. Increasing exports. We need to enforce our trade agreements. We need to enforce the international rules. Enforcement is critical. But we also need to open up markets for our products. Every other country in the world is doing it. They're engaged in opening up markets for their products, for their workers, for their farmers, for their service providers. We've been taking a back seat. This is why we need to be much more aggressive in forcing other countries to open their markets to us. If we don't do that, we don't have access to 95% of the consumers in the world. We're not going to be able to create the jobs that we need. The President has said that if you just were to pass these 3 trade agreements that are out there, you would create over 250,000 new jobs. Think about that. That's something that we ought to do. It's, again, bipartisan. Somehow we can't seem to get through the process of getting these agreements, these 3 relatively small ones that we've already done, through the process. We need to do that and do that right now because of this economic crisis that we face of unemployment and long-term unemployment. This would really help in combination with a more competitive workforce. On energy, another part of our 7-point plan, and again, this is a jobs plan to get us back on track. We've got to use our own resources. Natural gas, places like Ohio and the Dakotas, South and North Dakota have a lot of oil and natural gas, untapped. We now have new technology to be able to tap it. Let's use it. We may have the greatest resource of natural gas in the world based on some of the geologic finds. We need to use that and use it now, and we can help us get less dependent on foreign oil, a dangerous dependency we have now. And finally, health care costs. Talked about this earlier. There's some common sense things we can do right now to get health care costs down. Take out some of the costs of health care, including stopping the frivolous lawsuits we all pay for through sensible medical malpractice reform. There are some states that do it well. It should now be done on a national level. To get the costs down, allow people also to buy insurance across state lines, force the insurance companies to compete for our business. This is all part of a common sense approach, 7-point plan. Get spending under control, reform the tax code, regulatory relief, have a more competitive workforce, increase jobs through exports while enforcing our trade agreements, power America's economy with our own energy, and have, again, sensible solutions to getting costs of health care down, which will help create jobs. All these things are proposals I know that you, Senator Thune, have been working on, and I appreciate that. I guess I would ask you a question. If you are, as you say, focused on getting at this issue, do you think that we have a problem on the debt and deficit because of the lack of revenue through taxation, or is it through overspending? Do you have any thoughts on that, or any suggestions as to how we deal with, again, these historic deficits and debts that we face?
Well, I appreciate that was a great prescription, by the way. I think the senator from Ohio has hit upon all the issues that are relevant and important if we're going to get the economy recovering and growing and creating jobs again. And so talking about getting trade deals done and energy policy that relies upon American energy production, keeping taxes and regulations low and common sense when it comes to the area of regulation, and getting spending and debt under control. Those are all things, I think, that are part of a solution that will grow the economy. And I think what I would say to my colleague from Ohio with regard to the issue of taxing and spending, there are a lot of people, obviously, who believe that that, you know, somehow we just can get additional revenues, we can raise taxes and solve a lot of these problems. Clearly that would be very counter, I would think, to growing the economy and creating jobs. I think it would be harmful if we were to, if we looked at taxes as a way to deal with the deficit and debt issue. Frankly, I think most Americans believe, and I believe they are right, that this is overwhelmingly a spending issue. If you look at our 40-year average for spending up until 2008, it was about 20.6% of our GDP. And Obama's budget would have us spend about 24.3% of GDP. And so if you look at where we need to focus on, I would say to my colleague from Ohio, it is clearly in the area of getting spending and debt under control and dealing with that issue as opposed to the issue of revenue. So I look forward to working with him on these issues and hope that we can get some policies put in place that will grow the economy and get people in this country back to work.
Expired.
Thank you, Mr. President.
The senior senator from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. How much time remains in our time, Mr. President?
2 minutes. 2.5 minutes.
Mr. President, could I ask unanimous consent that be extended by 3 minutes?
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I've come to the floor today to talk about the #1 issue in the United States of America, and that's jobs. Also talk about an admonition I got from my father when I was growing up. He said, "Son, always judge a man by his actions, not his words." And I intend to apply that to you as well, him talking to me. Well, I think all of us should be judged by our actions and not just our words. And I'm very disappointed in what this administration is doing right now. On the one hand, talking about jobs being the most important thing America needs, but yet every single action of the agencies and the regulators is a job killer. Let me give you an example, Mr. President. Just recently, the most recent nominee to be the new Commerce Secretary of the United States of America is a former director of the Boeing Aircraft Corporation, an aircraft corporation that is now under a suit from the interim general counsel of the National Labor Relations Board to stop them from opening a new plant that will employ 1,000 people in the state of South Carolina, alleging they built the plant in South Carolina to strike back at the unions in Washington State, when in fact the Dreamliner, which is their main airline, which they're selling and got orders, tremendous orders for, is being built in Washington, but they had to expand another plant to meet the orders. They decided in the interest of the company to have one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. They weren't retaliating against anyone. They were trying to create jobs in America for a great American product. Yet the National Labor Relations Board wants to stop 1,000 jobs from being created on an allegation that it's some type of retribution. That's just dead wrong. The National Labor Relations Board this week came out with a new admonition. That is, they're going to change election rules so that new elections, instead of being required to take 38 to 42 days, can now have quickie union elections in 10 to 12 days, making it much more difficult on management to react to a union vote and a union movement. All these things are job creators. I'm not here to demagogue unions or to demagogue this president, for that matter. I just think fair is fair. If you say you want to create jobs, don't stop creating jobs. If you say you want the economy to recover, do those things that are necessary to empower business. Let me take another example, and that's the National Mediation Board. The National Mediation Board is the agency that regulates employment from the standpoint of airlines and railroads and transportation entities. The NMB is 75 years old. For 75 years, their rule on a union election in a covered company is that 51% of the number of people employed who would be unionized had to vote in order for a union to become established. Summarily, 11 days after their appointment under the new administration, that 75-year-old rule was struck to become only a simple majority of the number of people who vote, regardless of how many people are going to be covered in employment. Now, that was specifically targeted at Delta Airlines, an Atlanta company that became the largest airline in the world, buying Northwest and merging the two together. Northwest had a union flight attendants. Delta did not. Delta's flight attendants had twice in the last decade rejected unionization in a vote of 50% plus one of all employees covered. By changing this rule, it was specifically targeted to try and force Delta to go from a non-union shop in their flight attendants to a union shop. But even after an aggressive change in the law and an aggressive action by the unions, the flight attendants still voted under the new rule, which is much easier, not to unionize. Not to be satisfied, the National Mediation Board now has filed an action against Delta alleging improper activities. And I find this very ironic, since in the FAA Conference Committee, which I'm a part of today, we're trying to
get a chance for airlines and those covered to be able to have a legal action against a ruling of the NMB if they suspect the NMB ruled unfairly. The NMB has rejected it entirely. The leadership of this body has rejected it entirely, and that conference committee report languishes all over an issue that would create jobs, but instead they want to retard jobs. My message to coming to the floor is very simple. Actions count, words don't really matter. And the words to talk about creating jobs don't mean a thing if we're taking actions that stymie business or punish people for making investments that bring about employment. It is time for this president. It is time for each of us in the Senate. It's time for this administration. It's time for the Congress to do what the American people have done. Put our shoulder to the grindstone and do those things that bring American business back, our economy back, and bring jobs back to the greatest country in the face of this earth, the United States of America. And I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Maine is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-679, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 75, S-679, a bill to reduce the number of executive positions subject to Senate confirmation.
Under the previous order, there will be up to 30 minutes of debate with the Senator from Louisiana, the Senator from South Carolina, the Senator from Nevada or his designee, and the Senator from Kentucky or his designee, each controlling 7.5 minutes.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to close on my Czar amendment and encourage strong bipartisan support. Mr. President, we have a bill before us about the Senate advice and consent process, the Senate confirmation process. And I think it would be a tragedy to consider any bill on that subject and not address the biggest issue, the biggest problem with that process that exists now. In fact, and certainly also in the eyes of the American people. And that is the abuse by the executive over several administrations, but culminating in this administration, of appointing so-called czars as an end run around the U.S. Constitution, as an end run around the powers of the Senate, the balance of power of advice and consent and confirmation. So, Mr. President, my amendment would fix that. It would defund czars in their offices. And it's carefully crafted, it's carefully defined, and it would say we're not going to allow these czars to operate when they are essentially taking the place and the functions of what should be a Senate-confirmed position. Again, the language is careful, it's carefully thought out, it's carefully crafted. There are exceptions in the language which are important. I commend all my colleagues to look at that. But the main point is simple and clear and important. We shouldn't allow any executive, any administration, to end run the U.S. Constitution, to end run the Senate's important and appropriate role of confirmation, advice, and consent. So I encourage all of my colleagues to support this amendment. In closing, I want to thank several members who have co-sponsored the amendment, Senators Paul and Heller and Grassley. And I also want to thank very much Senator Collins, who's been a leader on this effort, has freestanding legislation on the topic, which I support. We have and will consult on this issue until we properly get the job done. And, Mr. President, I reserve the balance of my time.
Senator from Maine.
Just the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
From Maine is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum be equally allocated to both sides.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from South Carolina is recognized.
Move the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to speak on my amendment, which will be voted on in a few minutes. This amendment would strike the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics from the list of the Senate-confirmed positions that would be removed from the confirmation process. I want to explain why this is important, because this seems like something that maybe would not be important to pull out from this long list of nominees who no longer need to be confirmed. It's very important that this particular position, this nominees for this position, be vetted and confirmed by the Senate. It's often said that statistics don't lie. People do. And particularly in this business, we've seen one set of statistics be interpreted and publicized in totally different ways. And that's why this position is so important. The role that they have is critical. And in a democracy in a free country, one of the most important things to protect is against that risk of the government becoming a propaganda machine. And I just wanted to read here for a second what this particular position does. The Bureau of Justice Statistics collects, analyzes, publishes, and disseminates information on crime, criminal offenders, crime victims, and criminal justice operations. Very important that this information is acted on by local, state, federal officials. Lots of our laws are shaped based on this information. And statistics are only as valuable as the reputation of the statistician, and that's really what this position is. Every member of this body knows how to write a question so that you get the answer you want to get. If we're going to have a Bureau of Justice Statistics at all, don't we want the public to have some level of trust in the data they publish? If we just put some political hack in this position, unfortunately, and that's happened over administrations of both parties, not necessarily for this position, but we know in some positions, it would totally discredit what this person does. So do we want the public to think that they're cooking the books to promote policy ends on issues like gun control or hate crimes or racial profiling, immigration, drug policy, and so forth? If we cannot absolutely trust the impartiality of the management of the Bureau, we should abolish it and give the money back to the taxpayers. We know we're $14 trillion in debt. Our nation is on the brink of financial collapse. My constituents have no interest in borrowing money from the Chinese to fund the Bureau to compile crime statistics if we can't trust the numbers. If there's even a hint of bias, of a political agenda, or of the head of this Bureau being friendly to the perspective of whatever party is in the White House, then we should abolish the agency. In the past, those on the right have been suspicious that the Bureau of Justice Statistics has had a bias against gun rights, against First Amendments. Whether that's true or not, who knows? BJS statistics are used to inform policy decisions. If the agency becomes a tool of the party in power, that will no longer be the case. When James Lynch, the nominee for the director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, was asked in his confirmation hearing what the biggest challenge for the Bureau of Justice Statistics moving forward was, he responded, "I think the biggest challenges of the Bureau of Justice Statistics moving forward are the perennial challenges to a statistical agency. That is to say, to maintain its credibility as an independent federal statistical agency." It's important that we hear that. It's important that Americans hear that. And we won't have that opportunity if this position is no longer confirmed. It's not often that you hear a nominee suggest that the number one challenge he faces in assuming a position is to maintain the credibility and independence of the agency he is about to run. But as Dr. Lynch said, that is the nature of a statistical agency, and it is precisely the reason why we should not remove this position from the confirmation process. The questions at the live hearing and the submitted written questions appropriately focused almost exclusively on this issue of credibility, independence, and accountability. How do we protect the director from political influence and tampering by the executive? There was discussion about ways to restructure the office to make it more independent and further reinforce its independent role. There was discussion of moving the director to a 6-year term to further reinforce his independence, a proposal that the nominee supports. Of course, a 6-year term would imply Senate confirmation. In every way possible, the committee and the nominee discussed ways to solidify the independence of the position and protect it from political influence. In the context of these discussions, it was once suggested that we remove the position from the confirmation process.
Senator's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent for 5 more minutes. 2 more minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
2 more minutes. Thank you. With all the nominees that are confirmed in the Senate with no debate or vote, it would seem that the confirmation process is serving a purpose. First, there are things that happen behind the scenes to vet and review these nominees and their backgrounds. Unfortunately, as we've seen, the President in some cases with what we call czars and other positions and recess appointments have sidestepped that. That has reduced the credibility in these positions. But let me just focus again on this one position. We never want the American government to be accused of being a propaganda machine, as we see from governments all over the world. This one area of statistics, where they're disseminating information all over the country that so many respond to, needs to be credible and independent. So I'd encourage my colleagues to keep this one position in the confirmation process, so we'll have an opportunity to make sure that regardless which party is in power, that we'll have a credible, independent voice dealing with these statistics. I thank the President for yielding me a little more time, and I yield back.
Senator from Louisiana is recognized. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine is recognized.
Mr. President, I just want to indicate my support for the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana. Although it is drafted a little differently than I would have done it, it does address a real problem. And that is when the president, this president or any president, creates a new position within the White House that really is duplicative of a cabinet member's responsibilities. When that happens, the result is that we lose our ability to exercise accountability for the policies that that individual comes up with. And let me give you a specific example. EPA is a Senate presidential appointee, Senate-confirmed position, the administrator of the EPA. Yet President Obama created a position within the White House where there is essentially an environmental czar. And this individual, Carol Browner, who's since left, actually negotiated a deal with the automobile industry having to do with emissions. Well, the problem with that is it is circumventing the Congress's ability to hold accountable the person who's involved in making and coordinating that policy. So what the senator from Louisiana is trying to get at is the creation of these unaccountable czars within the White House who are really doing the job that is supposed to be done by a cabinet official, by a presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed official. So I support the amendment, and I would yield the floor to Senator Schumer.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the previous order, the vote in relation to the Vitter Amendment No. 499 occur at 12:30, and the vote in relation to the DeMint Amendment No. 510 occur at 2 p.m., with the remaining provisions of the previous order remaining in effect.
Is there objection? Senator from Maine.
President, I just want to make sure this has been cleared with the senator from South Carolina.
It has.
Thank you. I have no objection.
Without objection, so ordered. Senator from New York.
It is our intention to work on setting up additional votes this afternoon following the vote on the Vitter Amendment, on the DeMint Amendment No. 510. Now, Mr. President, I rise in strong opposition to the amendment offered by my colleague from Louisiana, Mr. Vitter. Now, as you know, the underlying bill is the product of a bipartisan gentleman's agreement reached earlier this year that seeks to streamline and otherwise improve the efficiency of the Senate's confirmation process. The senator from Maine, the senator from Tennessee, the senator from Connecticut, and myself, as well as the leaders, Leader Reid and Leader McConnell, have been heavily involved in this process. The amendment offered by Mr. Vitter runs counter to the spirit of comity behind this important bill. It is a poison pill designed to handcuff the President's ability to assemble a team of top-flight advisors and aides. The amendment's nothing new. It's been introduced several times in several reiterations, and now is the time we're moving forward. It's one of those moments when we can bridge the partisan divide and make the Senate a more efficient body. It's not the time or place to relitigate old and, frankly, I believe, silly battles about so-called czars. It's our constitutionally mandated duty as senator to ensure that the most important positions in government are confirmed in a timely manner. With the underlying bill, we finally begin to break the logjam that holds up senior positions by taking mid-level non-policy positions off the docket. So I'd oppose the amendment and urge my colleagues to vote against it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Maine.
I suggest the absence of the
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
So there's no vote.
President.
Senator from New York is recognized.
I would ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I also rise now, because of the change in time schedule, to speak against the amendment offered by Mr. DeMint. Like the Vitter Amendment, this amendment is opposed to the great spirit of comity behind the underlying bill. I'd like to remind my colleague from South Carolina that the bipartisan working group labored over every decision we made. Far from lifting our index fingers to the wind, we carefully debated the nuances of the changes that were ultimately proposed. The change that the senator from South Carolina takes fault with involves the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Now, let me tell you about this position. The director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics reports to the Senate-confirmed Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs, who then reports to the Senate-confirmed Associate Attorney General, who then reports to the Senate-confirmed Deputy Attorney General, who, you guessed it, reports to the Attorney General, also confirmed. How much more oversight do we need for one man? Is 4 levels of congressional oversight not enough? It's clear to me that this amendment
is really designed to hamper our goal of improving the way the Senate functions. After all, there are 4 similar positions at the Department of Justice with parallel lines of reporting that we plan to remove from Senate confirmation. But the senator from South Carolina does not take aim at those. Simply put, this is a prime example of the type of amendment that slows the Senate down. We're trying to find the type of amendment that is really aimed at preventing the passage of this bill. The number of Senate-confirmed positions has increased by hundreds over the last few decades. As you know, this proliferation has slowed the confirmation process to a near standstill. What used to be a flowing, functioning faucet now trickles. This position is one of those mid-level positions that should be removed to free up our process so we can focus our time on the positions that are more senior or do not report to so many other levels of Senate-confirmed positions. Removing Senate confirmation for this position does not in any way weaken our constitutional advise and consent power or give any extra power to the President. This power was given to us to be used to confirm the most senior policy-making provisions, and the President has power to appoint his mid-level and lower-level appointees. So I oppose this amendment, which will be voted on after our respective lunches, and urge my colleagues to join me in voting against it. Thank you, and I yield the floor, Madam President. And I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cochran.
The senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for no more than 10 minutes.
We're in a quorum call.
I apologize. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
And I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for no more than 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Last week, Minority Leader Pelosi and some of her colleagues signaled their intention to introduce a discharge resolution for a vote on H.R. 639, the Currency Reform for Fair Trade Act. I applaud those in this body and in the House of Representatives who want to push on currency reform and encourage the Speaker and House leadership to support this position. This legislation had passed, similar legislation had passed overwhelmingly with strong bipartisanship in the last Congress. Senator Snowe from Maine and I introduced that legislation in the Senate. It would strengthen countervailing duties laws to consider undervalued currency as an unfair subsidy in determining duty rates. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that we have, in essence, we have lost jobs in this country because too often the playing field in our trade relationship with the People's Republic of China is simply not level. We know that China, in far too many cases, subsidizes energy. We know they subsidize land. We know they subsidize capital. We know they subsidize production in various kinds of ways. And we also know, in terms of currency, that China doesn't play fair. So when an industry like the coated paper industry in Hamilton, Ohio, and southwest Ohio, north of Cincinnati, or the aluminum industry in western Ohio and Sydney, or the steel industry in Lorain, Ohio, when an industry petitions the International Trade Commission for relief against unfair subsidies, currency manipulation would be part of that investigation. That bill would make sure that happens. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's achievable. It sends a signal, Madam President, to our trading partners that we won't sit idly by while other countries game the system, gaining an unfair advantage over American workers and American businesses. I can't count the number of times, Madam President. I know in North Carolina you've seen the same situation in textiles and in other industries where, simply put, American workers have trouble competing and American businesses have trouble selling their products because of unfair trade advantages that countries and companies in those countries have inflicted on the United States. Don't forget the stakes. We're all concerned about the budget deficit, to be sure, and we heard Senator Conrad earlier talking about that. And in a convincing, persuasive way. Cut the budget, set it up long-term, medium-term. Don't do it right now, as Chairman Bernanke, a Republican appointee, says that will cost us jobs, but build in that kind of deficit reduction. Think about the budget deficit, but don't forget the trade deficit. We have, over the last 10 years, particularly since most favored nation status with China and NAFTA and then the Bush administration's trade agenda on CAFTA and other trade agreements and the lack of enforcement of those trade agreements, we've seen the kinds of job loss because of those trade agreements. Madam President, President Bush once said that $1 billion in trade surplus or trade deficit translates into 13,000 jobs. Why is that? If you have a budget surplus of $1 billion, you have 13,000 more jobs in your country. If you have a trade deficit of $1 billion, you have 13,000 fewer jobs. The reason's pretty clear. If you have a $1 billion trade deficit, it means you are buying $1 billion worth of goods more from country X, China, let's say, than you're selling to China. That means the production, $1 billion worth of production, $1 billion worth more of production is taking place in China than in the U.S. That's okay, but when the numbers are hundreds of billions of dollars, our trade deficit is fluctuated between about $400 and $750 billion. Between $1 billion a day and $2 billion a day, that's real jobs. Multiply those numbers by $13,000 per $1 billion, and you see the kind of job loss we have in the United States of America, especially in manufacturing, hitting those communities like Lorraine or Mansfield or Springfield or Dayton or Youngstown or Cleveland or cities in western New York and Syracuse and Rochester or cities in North Carolina. You can see what it's done in small towns and urban areas alike to our job growth. In April 2011, our total trade deficit in that month alone was $54 billion. Our trade deficit with China in that month alone was $21 billion. Paul Krugman, a reporter, a columnist in the New York Times, said if you want a trade policy that helps employment, it has to be a policy that induces other countries to run bigger deficits or smaller surpluses. A countervailing duty on Chinese exports would be job-creating. A deal with South Korea would not be. Now, I'm not here today to argue or to debate or to even be critical of the free trade agreement with South Korea. I think it's a bad idea. I hear the promises of administration after administration. This administration at least hasn't overpromised like the Bush and Clinton administrations did on creation of jobs, on trade. But we know every time there's a trade agreement, trade deficit goes up, job loss accelerates, especially in manufacturing. So, Madam President, the point is one major thing we can do about this is what the House of Representatives is trying to do, and that's pass the Currency Reform for Fair Trade Act. It will simply mean that China and the United States are on a more more level playing field, a more even relationship. It will save and help to increase manufacturing jobs. We know that manufacturing jobs are a ticket to the middle class. The Republic of Germany, the country of Germany, 20% of its workforce in Germany is in manufacturing. Only 10% of our workforce is in manufacturing. Germany has higher unionization rates, higher wages, and a budget surplus, a trade surplus. The United States has, as I pointed out, between, almost $1 billion a day trade deficit with China. And somewhat less than that, not much, and up to $2 billion a day trade deficit with the whole world as a whole. Clearly, our trade policy isn't working. Currency reform is one major step in fixing that. It's something that I hope this Senate takes up sooner rather than later, and the House of Representatives does the same. Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.